Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll be talking about the Civil War and the U.S. occupation of the Dominican Republic that occurred in 1965. So I'll just be going over some of the facts that led up to this revolution. The Dominican Republic has been no stranger to foreign intervention and occupancy from foreign entities. Having endured multiple invasions from the Haitian government during the 19th century, the Dominican Republic also dealt with repeated interference from the United States government throughout the 20th century. As part of its Monroe Doctrine, U.S. imperialism regarded all of Latin America as its quote-unquote backyard. In 1905, the United States government sent customs agents to the Dominican Republic to make sure it paid its debts. In 1916, U.S. Marines invaded the island again, occupying the country until 1924. During that occupation, the U.S. trained and organized a brutal National Guard to enforce U.S. interests. In 1930, Rafael Trujillo, a general in the U.S.-trained National Guard, came to power in rigged presidential elections. For the next 31 years, Trujillo distinguished himself as a particularly brutal and corrupt dictator. The Trujillo regime, like the regimes of Anastasio Somoza in Nicaragua and Fulgencio Batista in Cuba, provided stability for the pro-imperialist sections of the Dominican ruling class at the expense of mass repression of the country's working classes. Washington's attitude toward the Trujillo dictatorship was best summarized by a quote often attributed to U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt or his Secretary of State Cordell Hull. Quote unquote, Trujillo is an SOB, but he's our SOB. However, the political landscape changed in 1959 with the victory of Fidel Castro's July 26 movement against the Batista dictatorship. Fears swept through U.S. ruling circles that the traditional Latin American dictatorships were not sufficient to contain mass opposition and revolution. At the same time, sectors of the Dominican ruling class were growing restless with Trujillo's corruption. The wealth that Trujillo, his family, and his cronies had accumulated came not just from the exploitation of the Dominican Republic's workers and peasants, but also at the expense of any native capitalists not linked to the Trujillo regime. In May 1961, Trujillo was assassinated, likely with the knowledge, if not support, of the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. When Trujillo's family tried to hold on to power, the U.S. deployed 1,800 Marines off the coast until the family went into exile. Troubles in the Dominican Republic began in 1961, following Trujillo's assassination. Trujillo had been a brutal leader, but his strong anti-communist stance helped him retain the support of the United States. His death led to the rise of a reformist government headed by Juan Bosch, who was elected president in 1962. Bosch then tried to implement a number of social democratic reforms. The Dominican military, however, despised Bosch and his quote-unquote liberal policies. Members of the clergy, the military, and business magnates initiated a rumor campaign accusing Bosch of being a communist. Bosch was overthrown in 1963. On September 25, 1963, a group of 25 senior military commanders led by Elias Wessing y Wessing expelled Bosch from the country and instated Donald Reed Cabral as the new president. Cabral failed to gather popular support, and several factions prepared to launch coups. Political chaos gripped the Dominican Republic as various groups, including the increasingly splintered military, struggled for power. By 1965, a number of forces were organizing for the return of Bosch, who was in exile in Puerto Rico. Within the military, constitutionalists, those loyal to Bosch's 1963 constitution, were led by Colonel Francisco Camaño Deño and Lieutenant Colonel Rafael Fernández Domínguez. Communists like the Dominican People's Movement, MPD, led by Máximo López Molina, and the June 14 movement also played important roles in organizing within the working-class neighborhoods. The Constitutionalists comprised of 1,500 regulars and 5,000 armed civilians, and they were equipped with 5+ light tanks and 1 gunboat. On April 24, 1965, constitutionalist forces led by Fernández and Camaño broke ranks with the Reed Cabral puppet government. They handed out guns to supporters in the capital, Santo Domingo. Within the first hours, they freed all political prisoners, called for the repatriation of the Dominicans who had fled or had been exiled, and began purging the military and the Supreme Court of its conservative members. The rebel forces took control of much of the capital and had a key position at the Duarte Bridge, which linked the east and west parts of the city. Just when order seemed to have returned, civil war broke out the following day as conservative top military leaders, calling themselves Loyalists, launched a counter-revolutionary attack. The Loyalists were comprised of 2,200 regulars, 35 light tanks, 13 armored cars, 1 frigate, and the backing of the U.S. On April 25, 1965, 4 Loyalist P-51 Mustangs conducted aerial bombings of the National Palace and other constitutionalist positions. A single Loyalist vessel, Mella, situated on the Osama River, also bombarded the palace. Aerial bombardment brought death and destruction. Thousands of unarmed civilians poured out into the streets in the midst of air raids. Angry crowds of people began rounding up families of pilots residing in the more affluent neighborhoods of Santo Domingo, forcing them to appear on TV broadcasts and pleading with the pilots to stop the bombardment and taking the lives of innocent people. Fearing a mob that had gathered at the palace would lynch Reed, rebel commander Francisco Camaño allowed him to escape, as Reed had already lost the support of the Loyalists. The majority of the DRP leadership fled the capital, while constitutionalists mobilized a total of 5,000 armed civilians and 1,500 members of the military. On April 26, José Rafael Molina Ureña was declared provisional president, while large crowds gathered in the streets demanding Bosch's return from exile. On April 27th, Loyalist Army forces launched a raid on the Duarte Bridge, but were beaten by rebels who, the Loyalists said, fought like cornered bulls. Back in the United States, fear spread that another Cuba was in the making in the Dominican Republic. In fact, many officials strongly suspected that Fidel Castro was behind the violence. In an effort to forestall what he claimed would be a communist dictatorship in DR, President Lyndon B. Johnson sent more than 22,000 U.S. troops to restore order on the island. Johnson's action provoked loud protests in Latin America and skepticism among many in the United States. As evidence of the quote-unquote communist threat, Johnson provided American reporters with lists of suspected communists in the nation. Even cursory reviews of the list revealed that the evidence was extremely flimsy. Some of the people on the list were dead, and others could not be considered communists by any stretch of the imagination. Many Latin American governments and private individuals and organizations condemned the U.S. invasion of the Dominican Republic as a return to the gunboat diplomacy of the early 20th century, when U.S. Marines invaded and occupied a number of Latin American nations on the slightest pretext. In the U.S., politicians and citizens who were already skeptical of Johnson's policy in Vietnam heaped scorn on Johnson's statements about the communist danger in the Dominican Republic. On April 28th, the full U.S. invasion force of 42,000 arrived in Santo Domingo. Battles between U.S. troops and their loyalist backers on the one side and constitutionalists and their civilian supporters commenced. It was the first U.S. military intervention in Latin America in more than 30 years.
A three-man junta has been named to rule the Dominican Republic as a rebel movement collapses. It was an attempt to reinstate exiled President Juan Bosch, and U.S. Marines were ordered into the country to protect American lives. The Leathernecks were airlifted to the capital of Santo Domingo, where they killed 2 snipers who attacked the U.S. Embassy. President Johnson ordered the troop movement when it appeared doubtful that a stable government could be established immediately. The rebels claimed rule of the country, but their regime collapsed when neutral naval and army units joined government forces led by General Wesson. He was the leader of the rebellion in 1963 that ousted President Bosch on charges that he was pro-Castro.
At 2:16 a.m. on April 30th, 1965, the 3rd Brigade of the 82nd Airborne Division landed at the San Isidro Air Base, beginning the American military intervention in the conflict. During the next couple of hours, 2 brigade combat teams and heavy equipment were also dispatched. A force of 1,700 Marines of the 6th Marine Expeditionary Unit occupied an area containing a number of foreign embassies. Earlier in the day, the OAS, Organization of American States, issued a resolution calling the combatants to end all hostilities. At 4:30 p.m., representatives of the Loyalists, the rebels, and the U.S. military signed a ceasefire that was to take effect at 11:45 p.m. The treaty's timing favored the demoralized Loyalists, who at that point lost control of Ciudad Colonial.
And will permit the establishment establishment of another communist government in the Western Hemisphere. Hermanos, esposas, que han visto caer en las trincheras del honor a sus seres más queridos. Pero les digo que la sangre de esos mártires no ha sido derramada en vano. Ella abona el terreno de la gloria patria y la obligación sagrada de nuestra parte de ofrecer el mismo precio por el triunfo de esta causa. Les digo a todos que no daré un paso atrás. Pese a la fuerza colosal que nos amenaza, esa fuerza no nos atemoriza, sino que estimula nuestro sentir dominicanista y nuestra capacidad de lucha.
Eso digo con voz dura porque soy un pueblo ajeno. Eso digo con voz dura porque soy hijo del pueblo. Esas copias asesinas, mil veces malditos sean. Dominicanos que termina y eso lo hemos comenzado.
On May 5th, the OAS Peace Committee arrived in Santo Domingo, and a second definite ceasefire agreement was then signed, ending the main phase of the Civil War. Under the Act of Santo Domingo, OAS was tasked with overseeing the implementation of the peace deal, as well as distributing food and medication through the capital. On May 26, U.S. forces began gradually withdrawing from the island. On June 15th, the Constitutionalists launched a second and final attempt to expand the boundaries of their stronghold. In the bloodiest battle of the intervention, the rebels began their attack on U.S. outposts. Employing the greatest firepower to date, they used tear gas grenades, .50 caliber machine guns, 20 mm guns, mortars, rocket launchers, and tank fire. The 1st Battalions of the 505th and 508th Infantry quickly went off to the defensive. 2 days of fighting cost the U.S. 5 KIA and 31 WIA. The OAS forces, consisting of a large number of Brazilians and whose orders were to remain at their defenses, counted 5 wounded. The Constitutionalists claimed 67 dead and 165 injured. A 4-month stalemate ensued in the glare of the international press, with the rebels holding out in downtown Santo Domingo while the United States and the Dominican government it had created controlled the rest of the country. The occupation had lasted over the course of 6 months. A total of 6,000 to 10,000 Dominicans were killed in combat with the U.S. occupation troops. On August 31st, 1965, the Civil War formally ended when the Constitutionalists and Loyalist forces signed an agreement forming a provisional government with elections to be held in 1966. But by that time, the progressive Social Democratic and Communist forces had suffered serious blows. Finally, in September 1965, a provisional government was established. Elections followed in June 1966. Camaño was forced into exile in January 1966 after a series of attempts on his life. Juan Bosch returned from exile to participate in the elections, but was confined to his home by police threats and was unable to mount a real campaign. Rafael Dominguez would be killed in an ambush by U.S. troops around the National Palace. He was 30 years old. Elections were held again on July 1st, 1966, pitting Reformist Party U.S.-backed candidates Joaquín Balaguer against Juan Bosch. Balaguer, of course, won the presidency and went on to serve an additional 22 years in office, basically another dictatorship, with full support of the United States government. His repressive, U.S.-backed government could only have been quote-unquote democratic by hypocritical U.S. standards. On September 21, 1966, the last OAS peacekeepers withdrew from the island, ending the foreign intervention in the conflict. For Dominicans today that lived through and experienced this chaotic time back in 1965, it takes some to a memory of when Dominicans were outraged by the level of disregard and disrespect of their vote less than a year earlier. This was a people who had just emerged from over 30 years of a tyrannical dictatorship, and they had taken all of their frustrations and hopes to the ballot, just to have their hopes taken away from them. While the outcome of this revolution did not turn out the way many Dominicans had hoped for, it nonetheless showed the strength and the perseverance of the Dominican people and their willingness to fight for their freedom. And that's it for this video, everyone. I do hope that you guys enjoyed it. For any Dominicans that may be listening and have some additional information to add, please feel free to do so. I, of course, did not include every last detail because it was a lot of details behind the situation. But again, feel free to add any additional info. So you guys already know the deal. Give this video a thumbs up, leave a comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll check you guys in the next one. Bye!